Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman archaic warfare between the late 4th and the early 3rd century BC, and more specifically of the annual rhythm of warfare and the role of the Soci, that is to say the allies, broadly meant. We have already made recently a couple of introductory videos about the nature of Roman archaic warfare, especially since the 5th century BC. We have observed also en passant a bit what the Italic background was about, the broader Italian one, because you know that there weren't just strictly speaking Italic peoples in the Italian peninsula. And we have mostly observed this incredible, right, kind of steamrolling, grinding war machine that Rome created exactly in the period that we're covering today. Today we look again from the extremes, roughly 440 to 265 BC, right? So appreciating in essentially the creation of the Romano-Italic Confederacy, that would be essentially as a res publica, at least Romanorum, and so the one of the allies that fundamentally followed them, the essentially the political and ethnic core that would bring Rome beyond Italy in an imperial sense. And so most of what we will surely see, time allowing, because, for example, there were made videos about the Punic Wars. I think I made something about the Battle of Ilipa. We will have, but to really cover in a broader sense much of that period, because structurally we haven't even approached it. But in order to understanding Roman imperialism, what occurred, and I think I made myself clear in the previous videos, to appreciate, is exactly this. Mostly, in fact, late 5th, 4th, and partly early 3rd century BC. The passage from feudal to imperial Rome, which sometimes is, puzzling to hear, as far as we have been told again that Rome was a sort of republican democratic regime and that the empire began later, and that this was mostly a republican time. No, right, we have, of course, highlighted how this has nothing. This is essentially an Enlightenment-born take on Roman history that eventually was passed down kind of somehow, for national socialist reasons from the revolutions of the 18th and the 19th century, was passed down to the masses to make them believe that some roles that were present at this time were present also in the past because of the role of Rome, etc. But it's a complete misassessment, essentially, of Roman history in many ways. I actually still haven't made that video about feudal Rome to core, which would be actually quite interesting, because there is really a lot there about clanic warfare, feuds, all the kind of urban, but also the countryside dimension there. And surely we have to talk about the Italics per se, right? A good video about the Samnites at some point, I think, is quite relevant, always given that, as you know, I've made, at this point, really several videos about Celtic warfare, Hellenistic warfare. We've already began to see, yes, some Carthaginian, some Germanic, right? So, as a medievalist, as you know, I don't specialize in these topics, and I tend to make them kind of less frequent or more marginal to the channel. But actually, they're really vital also to understand much of the imperial ideology till the 20th century and even beyond, arguably. Meaning that the Ancien regime really ended in 1918, and that we're much closer to the order of mindset that actually Rome founded in many ways for essentially the world to receive. I would like to point out that, I don't know, the only other imperial example that we're looking at today in terms of comparison with Rome is a communist country schooled properly in Marxist doctrine. I mean, so there is something there in terms of the power of the West, even in its of course shortcomings, including the creation of the Marxian theory and eventually Marxism and all things attached. Not that communism didn't exist before, actually it did, but actually it's the rise of Rome is much more connected with that as a reaction than you may think. But I mostly leave this for the religious history of Rome that we discussed multiple points, and that I also hope to come back on soon. But here it's properly dimensioning from a political and military point of view. In other videos soon we may look at the social side of the story, especially the reward, right? How did Rome accomplish this, of course, but also how, as we will see now with the annual rate of warfare, fundamentally, how did this machine, how was this machine fueled? Essentially, what was the role of the Allies? And we will get more in detail with that. I think next to our main medieval warfare, together with other excursus of modern warfare and beyond, we can and we should or must properly look at these topics in some detail. Because obviously it's always a matter of historiography in many ways, not just reading Polybius is different from reading Livy or reading Plutarch for that matter. So those differences must be highlighted. However, it's also a matter, as we're noticing before, of how modern contemporary historiography essentially framed this period as well. Today we point out something actually quite self-evident, at least if you reconstruct chronikistically, especially from the Livian accounts, what Rome did militarily-wise, and what appears in fact to be a continuous war, right? Essentially, already what took the profile of a professional and imperial army already at this point. This is debatable for many reasons because, of course, warfare, endemic warfare as such, was present more or less in all the tribal cultures, and even the most advanced civilizations didn't keep either, right? The point is understanding also the scale of this, not just from the protraction of warfare, but also in the organization, in what this meant politically, why they were doing that, but in the sense realizing, in fact, on the scale of the accomplishments that are the only kind of pretty well kind of macroscopically accessible aspect, because we don't know too much about how the Roman army worked in these centuries otherwise, to make us, in fact, understand partly also what we cannot see about the latter aspect, right? As we've seen, fundamentally in this period, Rome takes over the entire peninsula as such, right? So fundamentally central and southern Italy. This is before the First Punic War, so the Romans didn't quite cross the straits yet. However, again, that would remain essentially until the first, the second, even beyond. We've seen even in some third century videos and beyond how essentially this Italic background remained consolidated a bit as a sort of counter on its own, right? We could include later also properly the Cisalpine Gaul in the north, etc. But this is largely like you can more or less identify. I mean, it's risky. You shouldn't do it just by projecting the thing, but of course, by late antiquity, you can argue that Gaul was a pretty defined thing on its own. It was very different within it, but it still was something else compared to everything around. Same the Iberian Peninsula, and so the Italian Peninsula. Of course, again, there are boundaries, frontiers within it. Think about Britain as well. There is a kind of Romano-Britannic first and then Anglo-Saxon reality later, and so also the Celtic fringe around. However, this land was kind of hardcore already designed, essentially, by the Roman domination in that direction. And this is not the video to discuss, but never let yourself fool by things like, political division equate to much cultural diversity, especially before pre-industrial times, kind of, nation states and so on, because the degree of coercion at the time was ridiculous. So when you look at these systems, you even wonder how it was possible they even existed by a degree. And modern countries were already much more homogeneous than we think, like even millennia ago, right? In many ways. And this is again something you have probably already realized from other videos that I make about at least major European countries that I analyze more thoroughly. But I believe this is pretty applicable to most countries in the world, if not all of them, right? Never underestimate how old certain characters are, right? And the national side of the story is like a cheap approximation of what that actually means, right? Arguably, we're losing that kind of homogeneity now, as opposed to pretending that now we have one, and that at the time it did not exist, right? But everything is also made at some point. I mean, there is no doubt that before the Roman conquest of Italy, in spite of essentially the Latin Oscan, in fact, Italic backbone of central and southern Italy. Yes, there was some Illyrian, there was some Etruscan, but some Hellenic colony. But again, demographically, there is no doubt there was an ethnic affinity, right, or kinship of some kind. No. In fact, broader domination had existed over this, but a unitary domination. I'm not saying a single polity, because, of course, when we will look at the various foedera with the Socii, you realize that it was, in fact, a truly feudal reality. I mean, in the truly kind of common law sense of the term, right? Every community had with Rome a specific foedus, in fact. A specific alliance or a specific relation that entailed, of course, it was unequal per se. At least the Romans had the foedera aequa and iniqua, as a matter of fact. However, at the end of the day, it was always the product of essentially a Roman conquest of some sort, and naturally cooptation of the elites, because otherwise that aforementioned Romano-Italic confederacy could have not existed. So it's crucial to understand how it could be forged in the first place to withstand things like, just in the same century when this was established, resisting so granitically after a Roman bloodbath like the one of Cannae, and of course also all the resentment that did exist towards Rome among certain Italian populations that Hannibal was making leverage on, right? And instead the system held. And it held because the Allies decided fundamentally it to hold, right? There are many reasons, right? It's not just that they said, okay, well, now we are under Rome now, it doesn't change, sorry. There is something to it as far as the binding connection that existed with Rome for what the latter had managed to accomplish in a kind of spiritual, religious, and moral sense, which was unprecedented historically, through the same warfare and through this test that basically any traditional culture regarded as this is God's will, right? There is some of that, but it's obvious that they would have broken those rules also because, in fact, it was not a statal reality. It was very much ad personam. So maybe a chieftain, a clan, a house, a family, whatever, had, basically devoted the entire people or tribe to Rome. And somebody else said, that was not made actually in my name as well, albeit it's debatable because, of course, the way they saw the Imperium entailed that if somebody was not okay with that, they could raise their hands, and then going at war if they thought that this wasn't the case. And this is exactly, in fact, what we should look at, this incredible sequence of Roman military campaigns at this point, because that's the moment in which the thing was established, right? So that even if, for example, the Italic peoples could hope to have some kind of degree of independence or liberty or autonomy, because again, how do you measure that at the end of the day in an unpredictable future? Even if, say, Hannibal had succeeded in anything, and he wouldn't because he lost politically and strategically, but it was likely that the thing would have not probably ended just from a day to another, that Rome would have not been just so destroyed overnight, and that even the struggle for power in Italy would have resumed, and this was actually a big deal, and for how much it had been established exactly for even the survival of the peoples that had faced Rome, and had, after all, earned a place in her system, thanks to that concept of munus, of duty and reward and so on, that could elevate the same defeated to the level of the winner, right? At some point, at least, this would take centuries to be fully accomplished. But again, given that the thing was done individually, it was still a matter of, kind of personal, clinic elevation, and again, the political and social order that had been established had already showed who was above, who was under. Not just much Rome over these peoples, but also the specific nobilities over the rest of the tribes. And in what is evidently also a moment of brutal growth of the entire system. So, from which, of course, there was much to earn from, right? Because otherwise, you do not explain why, for example, even during the 2nd century BC, during the recruitment crisis, there was essentially no particular grievance from the Italics yet to go at open warfare like it would happen in a social war, and even at that point, just to earn a place within the Roman system, not to destroy it, right? And simply Rome keeping to expand after all, and or sending all these troops abroad, overseas, etc. This is why the concept is really important, right? So when you say, how do we actually know about the rate of war, the rhythm of warfare in this time? Well, there could be kind of a more sophisticated way of doing it, and surely there is a lot being said following the single accounts. But say if we were to look at it, from a larger scale, it's that easy just to follow the, after all, few information that we have about the Roman expansion in Italy, and simply counting the years in which we don't have news of warfare, which, as we'll see now, doesn't even mean that there actually wasn't, in the meanwhile, which is something that I take at heart, particularly as a medievalist too, because I made a research that was aimed, among the other things, exactly to highlight all those apparently minuscule fights that took place beyond the so-called pitched battles, as if you could even, separate a 30,000 versus 30,000 battle from even just one that entailed, 800 men from both sides. I mean, for the 12th century, you study that and say, wow, well, because it's obviously more important that those smaller engagements were more consequential than they would be later. But the 13th, the 14th century is full of the same, and today we don't even care. Right, so imagine, this is a point already made in the other videos, how true this could be for like the 5th to the 4th century BC. In Italy, by the way, so not really a place that was particularly documented at the time. That would be documented later by the same Romans and then by essentially the Greeks, as they had been at that point incorporated in the empire, but surely on the base again of some tradition of the sagas, of some written accounts, whatever, that were collected by the Roman historians, especially in the 1st century BC. At times we have external observers, such as Polybius, that also, but the problem is we mostly don't know what sources they were using, right? We can't guess, let's say, maybe from which entourage, from which milieu, so how more or less reliable they can be on the basis of whether we think that, I don't know, they met the people who were in that battle, for example, or such things. But that obviously do not, they are mediated by centuries of distance, and also a massive, an imposing civilizational development that was as sudden, as brutal as the Roman one was, for which, naturally, in the 5th century, in the 4th century, the average Roman mindset was that writing was for effeminated people, right? So the Romans were warriors that wouldn't write, because just, the Greeks do, those perverts, right? And this already tells you more, actually, than 1,000 accounts, because if you really try to make the effort, at least of kind of scoping the implications of such mindset, you can already learn a lot by analogy, by comparison, ethnoanthropologically, and you can observe through just, the archaeological finds we've seen of by the various arms mostly used at the time, how even the more iconic and kind of popularized Roman equipment came to be. It came to be exactly in the centuries, right? But it came to be often in ways that we grossly misconceive, especially because we're fixated with technology per se, and we don't really give a look at doctrine, because, let's be honest, there is no strategic culture in the world today of any kind. But it does start from history. You can, unless you actually you do actually go out to war yourself, and it's just also in that case a partial experience. You cannot build up a theory without military history, and this is what von Clausewitz says, by the way. So this period we look at today, as I said before, was one in which the Romans were almost constantly at war, with major implications for political, social, not just military, because you must have a military system that can be sustained in that kind of fast-paced rhythm by people, right? Their resources and more. And you must give them a good reason, because without their decisive moral support, you cannot do that, right? This was, again, essentially an Italic city, still mostly ruled by clans, right? That are also a bit the patrician gentes that essentially made this thing happen, from at least in a hierarchical sense. The plebeians were being co-opted already with the essentially with the imperium in their magistracies. So that also, without that, there could have not been a Roman army in the first place, because you need men, quantitatively speaking, and not just a few motivated ones like the Roman nobleman could be just by warrior vocation, right? So there is a qualitative step there, civilizationally, that we already observed in that video about the nature of Romano-Italic warfare I made a couple of weeks ago. And we are pretty certain about the fact that, especially after 327 BC, the years without warfare were pretty rare, right? You rarely find this too historically, right? Normally, if you look even at great Hellenistic kingdoms, mostly that were able to carry out a gigantic effort. The phalanx is a very expensive yet effective system, and you must to find a balance between the two things. That's likely also why, in the grand scale of the grand perspective, they lost to Rome anyway, and I made a bit about that too. But this thing was exhausting, right? So tribes also in Central Europe, generally speaking, fought all the time. However, they didn't have the level of political and social development necessary to put together a kind of even properly semi-permanent force, and especially maintaining it under a unitary control, right? So essentially Gaul would receive that mostly, but with the same Roman conquest, areas of Central Europe wouldn't achieve that until the 9th, 10th century. And the the civilizational structure costed. There is a broader interpretation that the Roman Empire may have failed in the end as a system because lots of resources had probably been burned. I mean, in terms of continuous, and you understand in fact that the entire system, even within the frontiers or beyond that, was already exhausted. There may have been other environmental issues, etc. But let's say definitely during the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, there were way less resources around for everyone from every side. So I'm not going to descend in that because it's and of course as you know, I don't interpret the thing in a materialistic sense because there was very specific moral, spiritual, religious mechanism that kicked in, and which is also very often misunderstood through things like it's the Christian's fault or that kind of idea. Now, there were other systems like the Carthaginians, as you know, were disgustingly rich. They mostly relied on mercenaries. They had just a kind of reduced participation of citizen troops. So different systems we will see at different points. I did make actually a video about the Carthaginian army organization during this period. I mean, during the 2nd century BC, mostly Hellenistic time. You can check out, and perhaps I will be re-uploading soon at some point. So we understand immediately, as we've seen in the other videos, that there was an incredibly delicate, say, specific, right? In fact, so far I think civilizationally unsurpassed in terms probably of balance, right? That Rome was managing at this point between the 4th, especially the 4th. We say again 327 because this is the moment in which essentially the so-called Livian Legion, right? So basically the manipular one, as it had been created de facto during the 4th century, sometime in between, in fact, this time and the Battle of the Allia River, starts taking off in that, in fact, kind of truly civilized fashion that could make a purist saying, well, these are not really barbarians as we expected they were, because they had taught that kind of mix between tradition and modernity, what the Romans called that sense the virtus and the disciplina, which also we will have to look at per se, because definitely there was a Roman way to tactics that sometimes is today fortunately not anymore, but still many people believe that would see a sort of just kind of passive emulation of hoplitic warfare or something in the system, but it's a completely different thing that, by the way, didn't have anything to do even with fighting against the Greeks at that point, because essentially the enemies of Rome at this point were the Italics and the Gauls, right? So, and I promise we'll have to make lots of videos on that specifically. However, what you really see, right, so historiography, at least for a while, was looking at the Livian Legion and saying, okay, well, after this, Rome really takes off, right? Because you have, in a few decades, the Battle of Sentinum, you have essentially the affirmation of Roman hegemony on the entire peninsula, and you have Rome being able to take off against Hellenistic powers like Epirus, at least in a defensive way, but almost, because southern, say the southern end of the peninsula was still more Hellenistic than the Italic interland, and then of course the Punic Wars. So taking the war somebody else's home outside, let's say the Italic one or the properly meant Italian one, it okay, we're not going to descend in the details there too. The point is that is being highlighted is that in order to accomplish this result, Rome was probably putting its military machine at work at least in a similar fashion, and surely towards that direction, since probably even earlier than that, right? The Battle of the Allia River and the Samnitic Wars are normally taken as the two chronological extremes, especially for explaining the genesis of manipular tactics as such, right? That is, of course, political and strategical reflection, but that it's somehow just how tactics, more or less, we think worked, and we don't have huge evidence on it, but at least we can point something out in that direction. And there are reasons why we pick these chronological extremes. The point, though, is that that explains to us mostly how the Romans conceived their armies on the battlefield, right, as far as properly the tactical ends were concerned. But the spring that had brought this system to be shaped, or to start going in that direction, was already the condition of perennial warfare that we can at least historically document since the second half of the 5th century BC, around 440, because from there on you have a prevalence of annual warfare that speaks, as also the siege of Veii that would occur in a while, so with the establishment of the salarium for the miles that receives literally the millet, that's how we're actually the thing comes from. And so properly the creation of a soldiery as opposed to just, I don't know, clanic war bands and or some kind of peasant militia, right? If we want to roughly separate them in kind of the patricians and the plebeians, but they were fighting together anyhow. So this is not even to say, of course, that 440 per se is just a specifically important date. It's just the one that we can start documenting this historically. Always remember that until the 70s of the 3rd century BC, Roman history from their sagas was somehow mixed between with myth, right? So there was an incredibly unsecularized and unmodern mindset for which all of those stories were mostly the symbol and the allegory of something, right? And that also were put together in ways that we do not really know clearly and that we can read mostly from the 1st century BC, right? In Roman literature. Now, as I was saying before, like comparing also to the neighboring Gaul, to say, etc. This means, however, that likely, of course, Roman life was pretty much militarized from quite a long time, right? As coming from the Bronze Age, from a situation in which, yes, the prevalent mindset is that there are demigods riding to battle on chariots guided by the Holy Ghost, and fighting with the divinity from their side and trying to mold the world accordingly at their own image for restoring cosmic order, right? So this is how you would have reasoned in those contexts. Just the other day I made a video about the Mitannian war chariots, right? And what we can even derive from as far as that kind of heroic mindset really was, right? So this video doesn't even explain, of course, why Rome was able to put in motion the things. I made a video about the moral superiority of Roman civilization. It's essentially an Indo-European interpretation of the Roman religion. And the material side of the story doesn't have to be kind of overlooked either, because definitely Rome was, just per se, as the largest city Latium at this point, and in the Tiber Valley, in a populated and fertile plain like that, of course, at the center of an important demic and agricultural system that could sustain this continuous warfare, right? They had essentially an Etruscan domination slash influence. They had contacts with the rest of the Mediterranean already. They knew what was going on, say, in the Hellenic world. They imported grain from Sicily. They had connections, say, contacts with, say, Carthage, other powers already. They were at a crossroad, which usually, as a frontier, it does help to develop that kind of, again, medium between modernity and tradition, and creating the right combination to make things shine. Rome, as we know, had been threatened for a long time, but by various neighbors. So there was a deeply ingrained kind of warlike mentality in the same establishment, in the way to cope with everyone involved, because secessions within the same Rome, the conflict between the various hills, the Sabines were just next door, actually within what is today the same historical center of Rome. So that and literally from the other side of the river there was Etruria as such. So frontier par excellence, what you could argue, and a hell of a good place to entrench, to fortify, to store, and more. So there is a striking general pattern between the years that go from, in fact, 414 to 265. In the first 24 years of this period, so until 416 BC, annual warfare is already prevalent, right? It means that every season, as it's pretty deeply ingrained, also if you look at the Roman calendar, all the various correspondences between the festivals, the kind of the military connections of the beginning of the war season, the end of it, all what this entailed, we can make a video on those kind of things. But consequently, also all a general mobilization, right, of the Roman forces is to be appreciated for 15 of these 25 years, right? 440, 439, 33, 32, 30, 29, 24, 20, 17, 16 are the only years for which no war is recorded, right? In order to have this, there is a seasonalism in this. We talked about the ver sacrum that we can document among the Oscans, the most common enemy of Rome in the Apennines, etc., that was more kind of primitive and kind of tribal in nature, and that still had this idea that, of course, every year you had to devote a certain amount of the exceeding youths, let's say, to Mars, to Mammers, the Italic Mars, and sending them out there, raiding, pillaging, seizing cattle, land, women. Importantly enough, the rape of the Sabines is the same thing that was happening in Rome, except at this point it had become slightly more civilized, but I would put an emphasis on the slightly. And that, again, was just on a different scale what the same evolution of this kind of Roman army was beginning, right? So see, the yearly warfare, or at least, as we've seen here, there are some pauses, but fundamentally the aptness of a community that can afford to fight even multiple years in a row, right, with significant expeditions, is of course what we could expect from that kind of feudal background, right? There are some clans that fundamentally rule the city, that have a hardcore of kind of already de facto professional retinues, right, in terms of kind of that kind of heroic warfare style, that there is a pattern. So even there in the kind of Indo-European concept of that you find also in say, the migration year and the war bands, the concept that this guy is the one towards which you owe everything, because he's the medium with the divinity, the father of the gens, right? So of a stock that was felt also in a bloody sense, and that was the loyalty towards whom was sacred, right? Because none of the followers could be less than this master fundamentally, and of course what we call a plebeian element that was more kind of, especially in the city of Rome, you can imagine artisans, traders. I mean, people, especially under the Etruscan period, had increased their power in the city with guilds and all that could provide also with probably the material means. They were not much of warlike people per se, but they were surely very habituated to radical violence and the means to cope, well, to preserve their affairs. And there is exactly at this point, in fact, already a cooperation between patricians and plebeians, aside from their strengths, as far as properly the creation of the military, a military that could include both in a unitary direction. That is also a topic that we will approach better when we'll discuss the Serbian reform, so-called Serbian reform, and that have, in this sense, to organize expeditions at significant distance. We're talking about some even tens of kilometers or more, with some excursions, some raids, some incursions. I mean, incursions and excursions, depending on from which side you see it, in different territories around, and in which still the clanic patrician mindset is still very, very jealous about its own prerogatives. Right, these patricians owned a lot of people, of cattle, of land. They had all lots of, so outside of Rome as well, and they had all avamposts around. There is the famous episode of the gens Fabia that gets basically almost all exterminated in a showdown against the Etruscans in the north of the city, because they didn't want anybody's help, because they didn't want to owe anything to anyone. As a consequence, they were almost wiped out. Right, some of the Fabii did survive, also in later times for us to document, but there was this extreme kind of mob kind of mentality, that is to say, we don't really want to share power with a central institution. But warfare, and especially the threat that, as we've seen, had occurred with after the collapse of the Etruscan hegemony, where basically this gap had to be filled, not much in Rome that remained Roman, but in a wide region that encompassed essentially the entire Latium, but also other coastal areas in the south, had brought peoples from the Apennines, the tribes, to descend in the flatlands and to occupy, to invade, to raid, threatening the same Rome. This had brought also to the Latin League alliance. The Latins had been fighting against each other, but at this point there are these early connections that bring these agents to cooperate, these actors to cooperate, and to establish already likely a nucleus of what would have become, in fact, the habitual thing. That is to say, that the Romans go at war with their allies, right? Just the idea of a Roman legion and Latin legion. At some point during that there would be wars also in which the Romans fought against the Latins, having the Samnites from their side, for example, at the Battle of Suessa that we described as well. So naturally these peoples were pretty similar to one another. But this is, in fact, the point, that there was a condition of symmetry that highlighted and exalted that kind of moral and spiritual difference that makes that point was even more important, as if it weren't already, in relative terms, the most important one, in fact, in warfare, right? different shades of civilization. The Latins more or less already inhabited in cities of some kind, just like Rome. The other Italics, other peoples were kind of more kind of like mountaineers and so on. In any case, you have to imagine the entire kind of central Italy dotted in castles, in kind of fortifications of different kind, and of course of local clans, tribes, peoples that were struggling also internally to define who they had to be in order to oppose an enemy. So the concept of metus hostilis that stems from, okay, we wouldn't like to be under a single person's rule, but in times of war we need that unity of command, thus we obey. And there's a deep kind of civilizational improvement through massive cultural strength in this thing, which again this in Rome takes the form, of course, of the one between the patricians and the plebeians, as we were saying before. It takes all properly a logistics apparatus. You need supplies. Rome is populated and rich enough in the city and in the countryside to afford this, and it starts putting this system in motion, which it was evidently remunerative enough if it could be repeated for so long, because these are, still times in which you can't really replace resources so easily unless you actually score a dramatic success. Now, after 1416, we find another even more impressive pattern, because between 415 and 391, Livy records no campaigning only for the years 412 and 411. So these were practically more than 20 years of continuous warfare. 20 years. This is an entire generation. It means that the community fundamentally revolves only around this. Right? It's not that other activities did not exist. Actually, the peasantry, as we will see now, did have time to work in the fields in summer and still going at war, which is crucial, as you understand. Of course, there was trade going on, but it was also, as you understand, a type of warfare directed towards also the destruction of the enemy crops, cattle raiding. So properly depauperating the enemy's district, so that they wouldn't be able to, they would gradually soften up and eventually hopefully fall, at least because of the shift in the political balance in favor of Rome, which is the only thing that Rome, in fact, would want at that point. They didn't need to exterminate everyone. They just wanted to impose themselves on them and to keep fueling this system. So sending certain amount of troops and resources in the same way, and so also taking gradually control through the same Roman politics of these communities, which in turn would be under Rome's protection, and because of this would also be spared from themselves from important destructions that evidently were would have been more impacting than what Rome was asking as a tribute, right? And that, again, always remember, Rome, you can't really betray the Roman trust, right? If you here there were properly sworn oaths on the divinity that said, okay, if you fight and lose, I respect you, and I will not destroy you fundamentally, but you are defeated and you have to be under my rules. But if at that point you rebel again after having sworn not to, we will wipe the hell out of you, right? And through this simple but effective blackmail, kind of bullying, Rome managed to assert herself in a dominant position in Latium relatively early, right? But only through this kind of warfare, without which it would have not been possible. Most of this warfare, again, was, especially at this time, in the beginnings, in relatively short distances. So it was essentially the same communities, the same people, right? They spoke the same language, they had the same there was a kind of a shared Latin spirituality. There was the sanctuary of Alba Longa, Jupiter Latiaris, and so on. There was a sense of kinship, especially against these mountaineers coming from the east, from the south. It was threatening also the coastal communications between again the sea and the interland, and coming to raid as far as the Roman gates. Then, for the next 25 years, which is essentially the period covered by Livy in the 6th book and including the Anarchy, we have a pretty confused and difficult picture to reconstruct. So we're not entirely sure what happened. Likely out of war, because the premise doesn't set you up for kind of a peaceful moment. However, that may have properly engulfed the system, and it also would have showed how dangerous it was to be politically divided. In that sense, would have meant losing lots of resources that evidently were just had been also earned with so much difficulty, with such protracted amount of war, right? Between 390 and 367, we have only 387 and 384 as war-less years. The latter is, by the way, the year in which Manlius Capitolinus is alleged to have been killed, which is fascinating because he was, at least these are all again stories between history and myth, right? But the concept there is always a patrician, as we've seen with Coriolanus the other day, that he is somehow dissatisfied, in which the team gets down to the adjustment of the patrician and plebeian prerogatives in this. I mean, Manlius Capitolinus was the one that had actually saved the capital's arcs from the storming. He had thus primary role in that kind of spiritual charisma, and as far as also the political and military leadership of Rome was concerned. And he fundamentally was denouncing by degree the fact, for example, that the patricians, after having defeated the Gauls, they were retreating with the Roman Gold, had been somehow had appropriated themselves of the loot themselves. He sided with the plebeians. He practically issued a law against properly, at least complaining about debts and this kind of effect that was at the base of an important, say, of the clientary system of Rome. Also the same concept of manumissio and the traditional idea that if you ended up to be somebody's slave, it's because fundamentally you had lost the imperium yourself. So everything was somehow in line, just as the Romans were conquering other peoples in the same way internally, right? The patricians should have maintained kind of the upper hand. And in fact, Manlius' history, differently from Coriolanus, was basically betrays Rome, which is, of course, there was no other way for him to end, but ending. I mean, but in that sense, he is somehow convinced by the by the same people of Rome, by his same family, the feminine, the female element, probably, that corresponds to the plebeian one, in kind of realizing that Rome was Rome with patricians and plebeians alike, and so that the very haughty patrician, hardcore kind of background of Coriolanus could not pose itself as a monad against Rome herself, right? So this deeply ingrained realization that without an elite who disciplines the mass that participates thus in warfare, you cannot have the fulfillment of the Imperium, because you basically would have not been able to convince the majority, or at least the decisive moral element of the system, and for which you also go against the same system, you're done for, right? Malleus instead here is killed, and there is a damnatio memoriae of some sort, because even though he was a great hero, he is still fundamentally betrayed the internal hierarchical order of Rome, for which, yes, plebeians and patricians and plebeians had to exist, but obviously the first were above and the others under, right? And also what belonged to the patricians as the spoils of war, especially after that Rome herself had been violated by the Gauls, was something like, we are the ones who ransomed the Roman honor and so sacred power as well. So that there was a deep connection to the idea that it was thanks to other heroes of Rome, after all, that Rome had been entirely restored, not just defended in the citadel, in the heart of the sacred hill, when the temple of Jupiter and the great oak were traditionally the center of the world, right? Just like the Irminsul, etc. And so it was even just something that Rome would have obviously fought for, while the rest, so the capacity of reprojecting oneself outside, was to be achieved through the plebeians, as Malleus tried to do, but in that case mostly for himself, going against the entire senatorial order. And so the only one who could guide the plebs was the senatorial order, not by joining the plebs, or at least by supporting their prerogatives in an anti-order concept, right? So all these legions tell us probably something about stories that happened for real, about policies, internal strifes, clashes. We can imagine within the same Rome, even militarily escalating and so on, that explain to us what fundamentally is the order of the system and why it came to be the way it is. And so in that case, the patrician supremacy in this kind of in leading the way, because if it had been in the hands of the plebeians, it would have collapsed, right? Just like today. So the other convenient segment in history, from the revival of the consular constitution in 366 to the outbreak of the First Samnite War in 343, produces only 5 years of possible peace. Specifically in 366-64, and only because apparently there was a severe plague in Rome, in 347, and in the same 344, right? And again, we don't even know whether there wasn't actually any military activity at that point, which I personally doubt, because again, if you stay at war for all this time, it's just, you cannot have simple peace outside. There may not have been, for example, an expedition proper. It means the Roman army setting forth for going somewhere else. But let's say other groups, clans, allies. Of course, the Romans were involved somewhere. They interfered. They kept playing on, and simply, again, in that kind of broader picture, there was always a fight, right? A garrison protecting itself from a sudden assault, an ambush, some raids. That's still war, right? And still the element in which this system is developing through a continuous kind of, if there is any peace, at least a peace in arms. Then between the outbreak of the First Samnite War in 343 and the second in 327, Livy gives only 331 and 328 as years of peace. So another generation of warfare, practically. And this is summing up. Again, this means that practically in the living memory, there wasn't like if you had been born and raised there, all the people you knew were involved in warfare in a way or another. I mean, the clan leaders, if you were part of a clientele, were just the ones who were leading, fighting, organizing, planning, debating that war. As a client, you would have participated to those wars yourself. If you were a kid, your father did, right? And some of your relatives had been killed in battle at some point. The local slaves, and I will make a video about the amount of people enslaved properly that we know from these accounts, from the various cities that Rome and other communities that Rome subjugated, were coming from these wars. The kind of the market, the trade, production was fundamentally oriented towards that. I mean, arms and armor production, for example, was probably a pretty, advanced business at that point. Is surely connected already with a subtle contractation of some sort. I mean, since the siege of Bay, that seems to have been the case, because at this point, likely, arms and armor were stored in kind of some magazines belonging to the clans. There were weapons around, actually, and this is true even if you look at the late Republic, in spite of the various regulations, because Rome was perhaps exactly at this point making an effort to at least prohibit the use of, at least of pacifying at this point, the city and the countryside substantially by acquiring some sort of monopoly on at least on an important part of arms and armor production and distribution. Basically, you were involved at a deeper level, because it's as if the entire community was spiritually oriented towards that. I mean, you were affirming something that nobody had basically seen, because a tribesman can be at war all his life, but his tribe not accomplishing much. This was essentially a system evolving in a subtle direction that was systematically subjugating lots of peoples, and plus, at this point, at hundreds of kilometers of distance, which means there was a massive involvement properly in the land management, in how to organize the conquered territories, how to garrison them, finding the subsidium for maintaining them there, entertaining kind of important relations with faraway people. So Rome was growing to a point that likely, again, all her ruling establishment was involved heavily in all these activities and at very high levels. And again, the aptness, simply the natural orientation to war at this point was just normal. It was just, again, it had also in that kind of equilibrium of the various gentes of the consolidation of senatorial government, and also the plebeian associations, and collegia and so on, was based on the shared memory of a military lifestyle, right? There were stories, legends, tales about what did the Gens do, how did they behave in battle, what about that guy or that. Of course, they were all married into each other. They all, saw war as probably a sort of kind of political thermometer to decide what kind of what that house was made of compared to another. So this would stimulate internal competition, but this was now evidently framed under a unitary direction, for which Rome had essentially surpassed the main patrician plebeian struggles as far as the definition of the Roman political institutional profile was concerned. And so now it was evident that the system was so effective, had been so successful, that it could keep continuing to hammer basically anyone. This is time of the Samnite Wars, and as we will see also better at some point, like war in the Samnium was terrifying. It was an inhospitable, brutal, primitive, wild, mountainous, cold, by the way, the place actually importantly populated by equally warlike peoples that would ambush you at every damn second, would never kind of give up until they were kind of literally eradicated. They would also be able to descend in the valleys with compact armies and putting up astonishing resistance on slopes and places that where the Romans had literally to attack, to assault, going upwards and with incredible cost, right? So this required an incredible resolve, right? As strong as, of course, as the defender has an intrinsic advantage and also fighting in his homeland, etc. The sheer Roman this was kind of they were possessed in a sense. Like the entire concept of the same imperium was the traditional one of a sort of power, wisdom, and kind of power entering within your veins, right? Through especially Mars in that case, rather than Jupiter. Because if you say in the Norse mythology, Odin is still one thing in that sense, but a terrible cost and sacrifice. It's practically impossible to calculate this, but it would be interesting to see also what the Roman losses were, because at this point there was a consistent allied presence as well that paid enormous tributes of blood for Rome, but the bulk of the Roman army was still made up of the citizenry at this point, in order that kind of civic identity was somehow being affirmed in the Roman comitia, and properly institutionalizing also the clienteles and the social certification of the Roman people, right? Most remarkable of all are the figures for the period between 327 and 293. Right, this was the most important moment of rush to consolidate the essentially now a central southern Italian power, right? So at this point, all the enemies of Rome at the point had coalesced, right? The Samnites had made leverage on other peoples to join war against Rome. So the Romans were also projected in very different directions. It could be projected towards the north, against the Etruscans, against the Gauls across the Apennine, along the Apennine or towards Samnium, and already entering in pretty close contact with the coastal centers, the Atlantic cities, and so on. So a moment of, as we can see even from probably the symbology, what Rome imposed also to issue from the Allies in terms of coinage, etc., that there was systemic imposition of the Roman rule as the divine power manifest, right? And that in this period crushed fundamentally all the possible resistance that in the absence of an external pressure would have not been able to resist to Rome within this Italian space. So 31 years, war every year, right? This is beyond even generation. This is just the Romans did only this, right? Then for the 28-year period between 292 and 265, we are hampered by severely, by the way, by the loss of Believers' narrative. We do have other sources, albeit incomplete in many ways, still show that the period where we are not even sure whether war didn't happen, but that was not recorded at least, was the one between 289 and 285. And again, we're not even sure about this. 288 is 87, 85 may have been just years without warfare. But what the hell do you know? I mean, in this such kind of regional space now, of course there was war somewhere. There was some, as we'll see now, even some brigands banally to take out somewhere. The Romans would intervene. And the point is that, as we'll see better with an interesting example from Livy, the Romans wouldn't even, they would get bored at a year without war. They had a system that had already invested so much in the next campaign, just as a mechanism that even stopping 1 year equated to some loss. Even moral one. I mean, just think about the kids that were meant to go at war for the first time that year, and how important it was for them to kind of inaugurate their adult life as soldiers, as commanders also, as part of, mostly again, of these important retinues that existed in a already well-framed kind of manipular system based on the various, let's say, on a democratic base, fundamentally, partly also, however, age. So you simply wanted to prove that. You must, because even for your son, you had to show that everything had been in line with the others, right, after such prolonged times of war. Naturally, these are not the only kind of motivations, but sometimes they could be quite trivial, right? After 264, by the way, the inexorable pattern of annual warfare resumed. As you know, this is essentially the beginning of the First Punic War, which would last until 241. So that was yet another major step taken now, even at sea, right? Properly outside of Italy and against a formidable power like Carthage, and also opening to a series of literally to another world. The Romans had not seen up to that point much of probably of the Hellenistic culture. I mean, Sicily was really a thing, as you know, and this is the moment in which, in fact, Latin literature starts appearing, right? This is normally associated with the meeting of this kind of brutal and primitive Romano-Italic continental reality with the Hellenic city-states on the southern Italian coastlands, and that was an important kind of eye-opening experience as far as especially culture, literature, theater was concerned. Still, the Romans were very we come from a completely different background. We've seen it, and by the way, yeah, I mean, consider this warfare had been fought mostly in the Apennine, so in again incredibly brutal places that have also probably a geographical dimension, a specific climate. This, cultures are very different from the ones of the coastlands, right? So Rome mostly, and the allies that she could mobilize at this point mostly came from that background. So there were lots of troops there that came from that hardcore, deep Italic heartland that were just brought to places like Sicily, and they saw something that they couldn't even imagine, likely from what they from their homeland background. This could be interestingly discussed somewhere, but you understand that there is all at this point properly original scale, for example, supplying capacity. There's a strong state that is the one that Polybius fundamentally describes, right? So this is the peak, the moment of greater Roman efficiency, right? That is consolidating further would shine mostly during the Second Punic War, where the true scholar step would be taken, probably going fully abroad, not just in the Tyrrhenian islands, etc., and starting to rule over other peoples in completely different background, right? But the Second Punic War is so so impactful and consequential that, of course, we will have to deal with it separately in a completely different optic as well. But much of the background was this one. That's what I mean also when I stress that the Romans were incredibly fast in their civilizational increase. They passed from essentially in a century from already barely settled reality to, again, a regional power of imperial nature, which is mind-blowing from a provincial background, right? And it's how you have to come to motivate that. There is also an idea that Livy may be, of course, at some point not telling everything from the sources he's using, that it was sometimes deliberately silent and or unreliable, maybe because just the narrative was unreliable. However, the pattern of the military expeditions is incredibly consistent, that it's practically impossible. Just we know what happened eventually, right? With all these people's history, we know the arrival of the Romans from other sources, from archaeology. We know it was happening, right? So we actually know even too few about it, considering the scale of what we can assess did actually happen. So what does this mean? In less than 150 years, so practically from 415 to 265, we find only 13 years, that is less than the 10% of this total, without at least notices of fighting. So as we've seen, 412, 11, 387, 84, 66, 65, 64, 47, 44, 28, 288, 87, and 285. 150 years of continuous warfare from a provincial to a regional scale, with a mission accomplished outcome. Thus, from this brief overview, what you realize is that annual warfare goes back so far and deep into Roman history, and that it's essentially all one with it. You see, when you consider, again, the empire, say conventionally thinking essentially of a specific national ethnic heartland that manages to rule abroad over other ethnic national boundaries. So again, a country rules over other. This is essentially what an empire really is. You realize that this is, of course, a sort of perspective distortion, because what the Romans had done on a smaller scale was exactly the same before that, right? You can argue that any power fundamentally begins like that. And if we were as well documented in so many other realities, we would probably just appreciate that in a single way. The problem here is the speed and the, again, incredible compaction in the power affirmation that was to remain, right? You often say, well, quick conquests are also kind of short-lasting ones. Well, ask the Romans, as far as the Italic Confederacy was concerned. And this system essentially went on for more than half of a millennium intact, to say the least. And just to be somehow generous with the timeline here, could be almost 800 years, as a matter of fact. So this video does not provide with the actual explanation of how and why this happened. Again, look in the Indo-European religion playlist, because that's where we actually discuss this topic specifically. This is, however, enlightening as far as the probably what we tend to conceive as unfeasible also in our world really highlights. I mean, how a strongly determined people with the right political, military, and social balance can accomplish essentially like a blood and land compaction, right, of regional scale considering the times and places in an incredibly short time, and maintaining it essentially for good, and thus going against all those things like saying, you cannot really rule over other people successfully. I don't know what this idea comes from. I mean, I think in the West there is this broader kind of Vietnam syndrome looming over, because we all know that unfortunately, I must be honest about this. I mean, most U.S. people do not have a realistic idea of what foreign policy really is, right? This is a specific American thing. I mean, in Europe we have other problems. I know I have a mostly American audience, but American politics, I estimate in many ways for many aspects that are somehow being lost even apparently, or they're holding on still. But as far as this concept that fundamentally you shouldn't get anywhere, you shouldn't accomplish anything abroad over other people's boots on the ground, whatever. Look at what Rome did here. And we're talking about Rome, right? So when we try to flatten this as, but after all, the Romans emerged as a power like another. No. This is among the other things that we discussed in other videos. One of the most striking reasons why Rome was not a power like all others. And you cannot relativize this by saying, well, it's just a matter of perspective. This is not a matter of perspective. Politically, militarily, socially, this is not normal to happen. There are not other peoples around that achieve this, right? Other forms of political, military, and social accomplishment were striking, were incredibly successful. You can see even some parallelism here with the Macedons by a degree, but it's still a completely different thing, and something that lasted more, definitely, and then also the same Macedon, as far as the Romans took that over 1 century after a moment in which they still had to consolidate power in Italy, and they could have been thwarted at Sentinum, right? So there is hardly any more eloquent picture than this one, even in spite of our evident limitation. We would I don't know, pay how much gold to know exactly what were the actual commands, kind of strategic thinking. Of course, that wasn't something even in Latin to define the word strategy as we do in modern times, but how they still did that anyway in all this time, in all the details and all kind of the military reflections of how the Manipular Legion came to be, and how this whole system that we mostly appreciate in the Second Punic War came to be. I made, as you know, many videos about the Imperial Roman Army, and I often stress how actually sometimes we're better documented about the mid-Republican warfare than, say, the early Imperial one by some degree, considering also the scale of the dominion and so on. So there is, in my opinion, much more here than most of the things that are normally publicized about the Roman army. What I always say is that when you go out there on YouTube, you see, why was the Roman army so effective? And then you have a video that is basically covering the entire Roman history in 20 minutes and trying to explain the reasons why, and you're fascinated by how people even try to put things together, like, let's pose this question, and there is just a 20-minute video in which literally you do not explain why, or just start saying, there were two councils and this, and you don't even go through the major reforms or whatever of this kind of phases that are, or eras that are so crucial just for the broader understanding. It's still a strategy, because people don't get the answer. They still watch and they say, where the hell is the answer? But they still have paid money to those guys in terms of time and energy. But I think that taking step by step these aspects is fundamentally vital. Today, by the way, I don't have the time to talk about the Saki now, so I will just stick to some perspective here, because it's better to talk about them separately. So, what can we say derive some data about this political and social background of the Roman army during this period? Talking about annual warfare. So, as you know, in pre-industrial societies, the passage from seasonal warfare, that is mostly a tribal one, to essentially not just a all year round, because this is also an aspect that should be documented. Normally, even modern armies retreated in winter cantonments. In fact, during the bad season. But it's still a kind of military activity that surely does happen also in other moments. I mean, this is very similar to lots of stuff I've seen in the 13th and the 14th century, by the way, just this type of warfare. And coups, raids, attacks, etc. did happen. Of course, it was here in these years often a Roman army or a detachment, because that's also an important aspect of the story. Trying to storm a settlement and getting stuck in a siege during winter. Of course, it did happen, right? There is this kind of mechanistic view of saying, no, they didn't do it. They did do it. I mean, it's vastly documented in pre-industrial warfare, and I don't understand why people like just from the relative to pass to the absolute. Of course, it happened less frequently than what happened in spring or summer, but this has nothing to do with the fact that it happened also in winter. By the way, some places are really infernal in the bad season there, but consider that this is still the Mediterranean, so warfare is also just more kind of all year round. The Romans began their war season in March, right? And this was a bit the norm in the Mediterranean. In Central and Northern Europe, things were definitely more limited by weather, which impacted also the local production, whatever. So this explains also the degrees of civilizational development. Importantly enough, Rome, if you look at her between the 3rd, the 2nd century, it essentially just occupies the Mediterranean coastlands. I mean, that's where most of wealth was concentrated, where most of the tolls were paid, where most of resources passed, right? So just later, she cared about creating also a continental dominion, right? It happened in different ways. I mean, some part of the Balkans, the Iberian Peninsula, even part of southern Gaul, the same Italy, the Cisalpine Gaul, etc., were already kind of even Numidia at some point. I mean, it depends on the countries, of course. They're different, right? Very different among one another, but there was the idea, of course, this empire had to extend in a more continental direction, but it's essentially not until Augustus that this is fully sanctioned, also in a European dimension, right? I made a video about this, by the way. And this was obvious. It was the most profitable thing to do. In a way, the thing that this military machine was aiming at, and that also kind of bogged down because of the 2nd century recruitment crisis that triggered a completely different era, as you know, in Roman warfare, because eventually it would be resolved by the Marian reform, but that's the moment in which also Rome took over with her warlords and began to to dominate the entire Mediterranean and expanding in Europe at an unprecedented rate. So we'll see, of course, hopefully those things later on. I mean, we could focus on that, because that period between the second, also the first century BC, it's, aside from the second half, especially when there are the more, or at least from 58 BC, where, of course, things get a bit more famous for obvious reasons. But there was a brutal political struggle over that. That, as you know, also entailed the Allies, the social war, because those would be the Italians that actually carried out most of the conquest there, fighting also among each other in between, with hundreds of thousands of people mobilized right at some point. So that tells you also how brutally resourceful, demographically and agriculturally, Italy was at the time. Which is objectively impressive, even in that scale, right? Of course, it's a place blessed by just nature in many ways, but evidently what Rome did was just beyond that merely material side of the story. Things could have easily kind of just sclerotized into an incompetent aristocracy who just, wanted to live off its latifundia, right? And the thing took, even there, a completely different turn for the second time. That's also a reason why Augustus was boasting the accomplishments, naturally, of a system that was already century-old in functionality, etc., but that was restored in a sort of golden age fashion to an unprecedented extension of power. I mean, you have Augustan Templars, temples as far as Malabar in India. I mean, of course, they weren't built by the Roman government, but I mean, there were Roman merchants evidently there that built their own temple as far as India. Temple to Augustus. So, this considering again that just a few centuries before they were just battling against the various Italian peoples, literally blows your mind, because you don't have anything comparable to this. It's not true for the Persians, it's not true for the Chinese. It's not even true for the Macedons, effectively, right? Maybe those compare, because Alexander was undoubtedly the greatest commander in the history of mankind, but as you know, that also didn't last so long as Rome did, right? So it's also about the solidity of this construction. One thing that we get for certain is that the Roman citizens in any winter would know there would be a war in the following summer. Thus, the entire community was, as we've seen, geared for such fighting. We can, of course, think of how the various types of clientele connections, as we've seen, dictated this, how also the necessity of a salary, of an equipment was established, again, way before Marian times, literally from the Siege of Veii. So, as I often say, Marius didn't invent anything, right? It was all there from centuries. Every single thing that he just formalized, or, it was mostly a political reform. It didn't have practically anything to do with the military aspects that just followed, and in many cases were actually already there. Right, and that were in fact properly formed mostly at this point in history. You can see it from the panoply. It changes significantly, much more than it would do in later times, actually. And as you know, we covered that in part, but a further corollary must have been that the Romans will have looked for war when none was ready at hand. Right? As we've seen, the system also sustained itself with it. Right? And there was always some other kind of community or land, both, of course, to grab. Peasants were involved in this. I mean, again, the Roman army at this point is a people's army. Right, the peasants do not need to work all summer. There was time enough for fighting, even over important distances. There surely were some rota systems. I mean, not all the Roman manpower was of course involved at a time at all, right? But the predisposition here, where we think that this was becoming professional, especially as far as the leadership was concerned, but and the ways to say predispose for military expedition the population was concerned, and there was, however, an aptness probably also from the peasantry, from the farmers. I mean, these were the rank and file soldiers. They were paid, were kept, so they also contributed with their own resources. There is no doubt that, yes, at some point the humble Roman legionnaire did bring some of his equipment and other stuff, rations, etc. with him, but it's not that, if they had to make an expedition in Samnium, literally they came loaded with all what they had to consume throughout the thing. That was always largely provided by the states and or the allies, because the allies served also this purpose. They had to just leave their resources available to Rome. The Romans at different times of their history, especially in Republican times, were often supplied just by, for example, allied communities that lived close to, I don't know, during the Second Punic Wars, Syracuse at some point gave consistent amount of equipment to the Roman army just there at hand. So it's not much about even what kind of panoply they used. It was all pretty much, there was an average, as we've seen in the ancient world, in terms of this soldier essentially with a helmet, an oval shield, a couple of javelins, a sword, and if he was affluent enough, some kind of armor in at least in a consistent way, covering the torso, etc. Today we do not talk also about the various classes of recruitment that, of course, were something heavily kind of molded at this point, but we can easily do it. In any case, the shift towards kind of the more kind of anographic difference, like the youth, the middle-aged men, and the veterans properly, was disappearing towards more a democratic orientation, which means that people were just meant to contribute because of their wealth, right? And that weighed at some point more than the youth per se. But that was also an important barrage that helped selecting the commands, the troops in some ways that we will explain better elsewhere. There is a reflection also on the seeds of Roman imperialism, because if we understand that still the Roman people was a part-time militia at this point, because they weren't literally, individually, as single people at war every year themselves, it was just the Roman army, so a part of it, plus the allies. We can still, however, appreciate the fact that this, as we've seen, Roman mindset was quite aggressively and imperially oriented, right? Probably it's ridiculous to think that at the end of the 5th century we could call Rome imperialistic. However, we should also make an effort to understand what imperium meant for them. And this reflection is mostly really on us, as far as, again, our lack of understanding of general strategic culture is involved. Properly the nature of warfare, the primacy of the moral dimension. Well, these are all things that we have skipped in favor of some kind of more strangely and unrefinedly scant series of factors that we don't know how to bond eventually in a quantitative sense. There is no doubt that Rome here got something in her head that was deeply connected with their vision of world domination already. Not perhaps so consciously as far as, the world was concerned, because why, one could even ask what was the word for a Roman of the 5th century BC. However, of course, there was an idea of that, and that did involve essentially a transcendental dimension that had to bring the Romans to the limits of reality, of physicality, of something that war could, just per se as an exercise, if successfully, of course, carried out, topped. And basically all the background they came from was, as we've seen, kind of tribally violent, and was obsessed with the heroic ideal and what this entailed in terms of essentially coming back to be a god in the process. There is also a point of arrival, likely. I mean, of course, the geographic boundaries did have a significance there. Always remember, this geopolitics does not exist. It's an illusion. Especially today, it's used by people who want to make you believe that there is a deterministic idea on which kind of spheres of influence a certain country should have, which is BS, because it doesn't completely take in consideration and at the most essential base, the change in political and social dynamics historically. But it's obvious the Romans had to stop at a point, because literally there was the sea, and arguably, of course, that was easy to cross, but that entailed kind of a bigger step against other peoples, that part, at least, of the Roman establishment was more interested in kind of latifundia and kind of a more conservative, like, okay, we got this, now let's enjoy it and let's not think bigger than that, would try to prevent. Mostly the Second Punic War would instead unlock that kind of truly imperialistic Roman understanding, saying we have all the means to do that. We have all the means to take over the world. These people knew about Alexander the Great, right? In Italy, when Alexander was conquering Asia and the Persian Empire, of course, we don't know much, of course, about it, but at the time, the world knew, and in Italy they knew pretty well that they had an idea that there was a world of gods out there. And entering the game at the beginning was kind of scary, right? There were resistances also, morally speaking, because it's a big step. It's like something you've never done. You don't know what consequences this may have. It's very risky. They weren't very different risks from the one we run today, with the only difference that today we have, in fact, lost vision, especially as the ancients instead did, right? I'm not going to compare here the consequences of a nuclear escalation with the Roman political thought, what could happen at an Iron Age culture, entering a war in another, but, there are instances of entire peoples wiped out. And from their perspective, well, that surely looked pretty horrifying, right? I don't know how you'd prefer to be killed, like in a nuclear holocaust, or shot with a rifle, or gassed, whatever, but at some point the consequence is the same, brutally enough. And even restrictions on things like, cluster bombs, chemical warfare are pretty debatable. I mean, well, what's the actual problem in using, for example, chemical weapons, if not just the fact that they can't cause indiscriminate damage to civilians that we decided today? Of course, they have to be spared for important reasons that are not simply humanitarian, but they are deeply strategic in many ways. But at the time, certain moral influences did exist. Don't think that there wasn't actually just an awareness about this, because great part of the Roman success derived, as we've seen, exactly from the capacity of convincing the other peoples to obey, in a way, right, against the possibility of being wiped out, right? But the scale of destruction very often was comparable even to some of the most in fact, impacting one of contemporary warfare. So that awareness of the bridge existing between the absolute, like in the form of the divine, right? So almost a Clausewitzian concept, as I explained in the video about the Fortuna Kaiseris, and humanity was pretty well there. I mean, this is perhaps kind of overlooked about what we think the ancients thought war like, is that they actually did have a much clearer idea than us today than what are the absolute consequences of something. Of course, in some ways they got away more easily with other issues, right? But again, the risk of destruction, of instability, of these were just more fragile systems in the first place. I mean, the crop rates were ridiculous. The surplus as well. So this makes you see, even with much greater amazement, how could they fight exactly for 137 years over 150? I mean, the scale of this success is not, say, the material aspect is just a consequence of something they triggered spiritually. And there is an ending point. I mean, there is a point of arrival as far as they managed essentially to dominate central and southern Italy. The north was kind of more disconnected from the Mediterranean, but they would, complete that because there were important trade routes, there were important lands that would be colonized. The other day I made that video on medieval Parma that actually told part of the story of Roman colonization of the Po Valley in that case. More people to just bring in under also in this kind of recruitment system that at this point didn't have evidently any problem, right? The system worked, and it would work well until the 2nd century BC. That boundary was reached again also because most of the distances in Italy are, well, we're talking maximum some hundreds of kilometers, right? So from Rome, at least, naturally there is a great latitudinal development, as you know, from north to south, but essentially the central position of Rome was also quite useful because it could irradiate kind of pretty also closed territories. If it wasn't for the Apennine that stands in between, everything would be also much easily. But in fact, as long as the Romans occupied those Apenninic territories, they had the access to all passes free, and so they could simply move troops everywhere. And the Roman district and the one of the allies, etc., was so rich that there was not much that any people there could do. But realizing that going at war with Rome meant, loss of resources, of an incredibly driven power to be reversed against you, to almost a suicidal end, right? This contributed, by the way, to compact the system earlier, because it's not just the deterrence, but also the, you make up your mind as far as what you can become also under Rome, and so also there is an improvement there. Again, mostly the elite that manages to, to control the tribal base, right? So the dream of any tribe, say any chieftain in a tribe, that Rome accelerates brutally by having immediately at disposal this almost endless pool of warriors that have to be, again, traumatically disciplined to become legionnaires, but that essentially we know by the time of the Second Punic War were indistinguishable from the Roman citizenry, which is fascinating. Their warfare was similar, also materially speaking. They were pretty homogeneous cultures, but they still required, again, mostly from a moral point of view, that kind of framing. There was simply, again, this understanding that there were enough resources stored to, at some point, tame all the, basically, those who wanted to break from the Confederacy. And part of these resources were naturally used because they were shared with the local leaders in a way that Rome disposed of, and that favored naturally also a competition within them to stick to Rome and get more. So again, by the time of Augustus, Italy is such, right? It's the true base of the empire, and it is fundamentally founded at that point of a full Roman citizenship that was earned just by this, what had been a constant aptness to arms, and the possibility of getting even more than what they had, especially as far as the elite had increased in power and the rest had become proletarians abroad, so that you could have born a proletarian in Italy by the 1st century BC, living in pretty dire conditions sometimes. It was not a very different from most places. They weren't having it so badly, but let's say they could simply become more autonomous farmers, provided with the imperium as Roman, as legionary veterans, right? And of course, Roman citizens, as they were by birth already abroad in other countries. So that's what triggered, of course, the Roman conquests of the age of the civil wars and so on, because that's what they were expecting from their masters. The watershed here, if we can put it, is that by 460, 450 BC, let's say, Rome probably shifts the balance of power in Italy. By that point, they could have still been prevented from taking over, but those are the years in which they are definitely the strongest power, or at least because you could compare how, I don't know, the Samnitic Confederacy was, politically compact enough to withstand it, but that point, which in fact Rome also enters, goes at war against the Samnites, and she could lose, by the way. She is still, however, the most solid power in the peninsula, without any doubt. And it was understood by that point was also hegemonic in nature, thus, because they had the upper hand. So just leaving things as they were meant Rome just being able to erode the other's powers, right? So it was not just a matter of time. That's why the other peoples rose in arms against her. But they were much more disconnected, less aware, right, and less capable, also individually, and they were often separated. Right, again, the fact that Rome was in between, more or less, even though it was from the Tyrrhenian side, from the Adriatic side, it wasn't as much civilizationally as from the Tyrrhenian one. And this is also significant, in fact, in the balance, meant that Rome had acquired a type of power that, by the way, it was partly what the Etruscans had, but as we know from the Etruscan society, could have not taken off like in the Roman way, because the Latins were much less socially stratified, were more like tribal warriors, right? And so the Etruscans had this ultra hyper elite, and all the rest were serfs practically, so not even in that case the elite could do everything alone, but they were so conservative in that regard that they wouldn't trigger any change, right? And so this prevented the construction of, instead, an elite and kind of people army like the Roman one was. So an elite-led and a people-manned, right, army that could form that perfect balance, right? So it's as if they had, at that point, gained the hegemony that in a sense, the Etruscans mostly had, but with a completely different social background. It was incredibly functional to a military exertion of the unspeakable kind that we have just depicted. There is a very interesting passage from Livy 10:1-4, which relates to 303 BC. So we are probably, in fact, at the time of the so-called Livian Legion. in which the author speaks about one of those years that would have been apparently without war if, and we can read this, translated this goes, lest, however, they should pass the whole year entirely without fighting. The Latin is beautiful because it says ne prorsus imbellem agerent annum. Right, so literally they would have, not wanted that. Would have said, well, a year without war, what is this? Come on, it sucks. And the consuls made a small sortie into Umbria, so in the Apenninic heartland, because it was reported that armed men were making plundering raids on the countryside from a cave. So imagine the situation. These were brigands, of course, like they took refuge in this rural place. Evidently they had caves where they stored their loot, where they sought shelter, etc. And then the story goes, the Roman soldiers reached that cave and, guess what happened? You see, here, the Romans weren't even thinking that they could lose. Right? What is impressive here, perhaps I stressed it better in the other video about the Romano-Italic warfare, that even after the defeat at Caudium, and the Caudian Forks, when eventually the Roman prisoners were humiliated by the Samnites, made them pass under a yoke, from which also our concept of subjugating, that means passing under the yoke, comes from, through the Latin medium. They would understand it. They wouldn't. It was insignificant. To them, the Romans, as we've seen, respected the Samnites, specifically because they thought they were the only people that counted something in Italy that could be at the level of Rome, let's say, or at least threatening Rome from victory. But they, at that time, already, the concept is that the Romans make a war every freaking year. So even if you lose an army, as it did happen, evidently, more than once throughout this relatively short period, I mean, still 150 years, it did occur often, they would simply send another. I mean, the concept that there was an end to gain to this was completely alien to Roman mindset. They were just a steam-rolling machine, nothing else. Rome must win, because it was a divine mission. The Romans were a chosen people of God, and they were meant to take over whoever. Probably they didn't consider even the concept that they would stop. And what is fascinating in that is also the degree by which the Romans, again, allowed these peoples eventually to earn an autonomy within the Confederacy. The manumissio, literally, and the concept that derives from I defeat you, but I kind of give you some liberty back, because so that you can make treasure of that, and you can remain bonded with me, but still, and so being from my side, but also remembering that you are under me. This is the entire concept behind not just the Roman, but the traditional clientele universally. There is an organic hierarchical order, and war is the testing ground there. If you lose, I rule. That's a universal language. No other people in the world knew any other language but this one. Every single people in the world was in that sense devoted by a degree to that kind of continuous conquest. There was literally no other purpose. International law worked like that. The entire moral code worked like that. And technically it still does, except we don't rationalize it. Or perhaps they didn't rationalize it in the sense we would do now, as I could do it while I'm telling you it now. But it was self-evident. Like, nobody would even pose the question whether there was another way to do it. So because, again, the political and social structures wouldn't allow for any other mechanism to remain standing. This is yet another formidable concept. So that quote from Livy tells you everything, right? They were just by default up to war. They had this loaded gun, already hot for having shot, but still not having ended the clip. They, again, is there anyone else? They go after these brigands in Umbria and massacre them in their cave. Pretty effective. It tells you by the degree also how much capillary the territorial control was. They could spend their resources even for, marginal threats like this one. And this is a concept that in fact echoes powerfully during the time of the First Jewish War, when they deployed an entire Roman legion plus auxiliary complement for a, stinky garrison of less than 1,000 people, which is deeply fascinating because that was just displaying the manpower that Rome was willing to just employ internationally to say, nobody can fuck with us. Right, I will stay there, build all the ramp that you can still see today for the siege and the camp, etc. Just because, right? Because we can afford that, and that as a deterrent serves a hell of a purpose, right? I think it's quite impacting. And we have beautiful accounts, as you know, from these events as well. But we will talk about these things on another occasion. Today I had promised you actually a deeper insight on the Soggy, but then I realized there was so much to discuss just from the data of the Roman warfare rhythm that I think it's better if I talk about that other thing. It's actually a voluminous topic on its own in another video. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you as always heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.